Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Grantmakers in the Arts 2019 webinar, Funding in Remote Communities. I'm Lindsie, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. At this time, please take a moment to kick off the webinar with us by taking the poll to the left of your screen. Grantmakers in the Arts is a national membership association serving communities of all shapes and sizes across the U.S. and into Canada. As we think about how best to support rural communities, it is important to recognize that rural can include both remote or city-like communities. Furthermore, when supporting Indigenous and Native communities where art and culture is not necessarily mutually exclusive from daily life, philanthropic practice can look very different. So we're glad to have Lindsie and Reuben Roqueñi on the webinar to discuss this with us and offer their expertise. Lindsie is currently the Program Director for the Native Cultures Fund at the Humboldt Area Foundation. Before coming into philanthropy, she served as Interim Executive Director at Heyday, where she ran the California Indian and Nature Publishing programs. She is former editor of News from Native California magazine and a trustee on the boards of the California Historical Society and Open Roads Media International. Reuben Roqueñi is a nationally respected arts administration with over 15 years in progressive program development, management, artist-centric support systems, and grant-making expertise. He is currently Director of National Artist Fellowships at Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, serving Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian artists, organizations, and programs across the U.S. We're glad to have them present on this webinar. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate a Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Lindsie and Reuben. Lindsie, why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Sherilyn. So we'd like to start today by thanking the Native nations that host each of our offices. I am here in Northern California in Humboldt County as a guest on Wiyot territory in the Bay of Wiki in the Wiyot language. The Grantmakers in the Arts office in New York is located on Lenape lands that were also used by other tribes, and Steve in the Seattle GIA office is in Duwamish homelands. And Reuben, will you let us know where you are?
Hi, everybody. I'm Reuben Roqueñi. Personally, I'm of Yaqui and Mayo descent. My family's from the desert Southwest, home to the Tonoatam, Yaqui, and Apache nations and different bands. I'm currently in the Portland metropolitan area, which rests on, and because this is it's a place where two large rivers meet, it was a huge trading area. And so we're on traditional village sites of Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia, the Wimal, and the Willamette or Willamette rivers. And today in Portland, there are about 70,000 Native people descended from more than 380 tribes, both local and distant.
And so we also would like to welcome all of you, our participants, to think about the people whose homelands you are working on and how you want to show up to be guests in their territories as you join us. So Reuben introduced himself from where he's from. Dagwadawa, my name is Lindsie Baer. I work here at the Humboldt Area Foundation, but my family is tribally from Cherokee descent in the east, and my family is Cherokee, Arapaho, Filipino, and Danish. Those are where I come from, and I grew up in the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains here in California, and was a longtime guest on Paiute lands.
I just want to, we kind of titled this a little bit on our own here, and calling it The Nations Within. And this title is actually taken from the name of a book that was written by the late and great Oglala Lakota writer and scholar Vine Deloria. And so you'll see a way to honor him by taking a look at the top right. There's a quote from him there. And I think it's a way just to kind of frame our conversation around a kind of decolonizing ethic. And the piece there, the photograph is by a photographer named Cara Romero. She's Chemehuevi, and this piece is called TV Indians.
So we'd like to first start talking.
So
Go ahead.
Yeah, go for it. I think yeah, Lindsie, I think you should do that introduction, and then we can talk about how we're going to talk to each other, I guess.
So we just wanted to start you off with some general data. You've done the poll about where you all are in your funding for Native communities, about what funding in Native communities looks like across philanthropy. So Native people make up about 2% of the population in the United States, and according to the most recent data, the funding is 10 times less than that. So less than 1/4% of all philanthropic dollars go to Native-led nonprofit organizations. And we just want to take a minute to acknowledge that robber baron wealth, past and present, it's built upon the greed of settler extraction and exploitation practices on Native homelands. So Native people, we're talking about rural communities today. Native people across the United States were displaced, killed, forced onto reservations to make land available for this wealth extraction. So the placement of Native communities in relation to the placement of centers of wealth in the United States is not an accident of history. It's a product of intentional removal. Now, people were not successfully removed. There are Native people in all of the homelands across the United States. But when we talk about how we shepherd the wealth in our field, I think we have to take into account not just what we do with our grant-making dollars or how we invest our endowments, but also where that wealth was accumulated, and that all impacts the relationships that we're forming with the communities on whose land we're on. And Reuben, will you talk about the percentage of funds for arts?
Yeah, so I mean, just like all of us here at the table, those numbers decrease significantly when we're talking about support for arts and cultural practices, artist communities, everything that we support in our field. And so the number just gets kind of scary. I thought it was 23,000. Like my math got corrected. It's 2,300, which of 1%, which is just minuscule, no matter how you look at it. And so it's just something to keep in mind as we consider the opportunity there for funders to think about how to work in Native communities and what kind of impact they might have. And then I just want to call out the piece there. It's by a Canadian Native artist who's Ojibwe. Her name is Rebecca Belmore. And this piece is called Speaking to Their Mother.
So first, when we're talking about rural arts funding or remote arts funding, I wanted to look at what we mean by rural. Like, how did the rural become rural? And how rural is often a reflection of how the world is seen. If cities, if centers of wealth are seen as the center of the world, then the other, the not city, is defined as rural. But that led us to kind of question, in Native communities, what is the center of their worlds? Like in the communities that Reuben and I work in, often the center of the world is their homeland, and the area that's seen as remote or perhaps irrelevant are places like metropolitan areas that may not reside anywhere near the centers of power and community that these peoples have created.
So yeah, it was an interesting conversation just to kind of get us started when we started talking about what to present for this webinar. And well, one question that we had for GIA is how are we defining rural? And so we kind of went around a bit, around some different notions, and ultimately we, indicated that the notion is complex, and so we looked to some more kind of demographic explanations for it. And you see this map here, which I found online, which is roughly kind of a really good way of describing it. Another way of describing it is, some suburban areas are, could be considered rural. Small towns are often in rural areas. Another complexity that was added to it for us was that some reservation communities might be right up next to urban centers, and yet still be considered rural. It happens, you see that a lot in the corridor between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, outside of Tucson, outside of Phoenix. And so there's certainly an urban influence, but those places might not be considered urban. So we kind of took a long title just to try to frame it, mostly kind of tongue-in-cheek, I guess. But,
Reuben made a really good point when we were talking earlier that, when you're looking at things from maybe a reservation community, the small town within that reservation might be considered the metropolitan area in a region. And so, when we're thinking of rural, we have this sort of notion of like less populated, but we also want to take into account people's migration, so that via the Relocation Act in the United States, many people left their reservation communities. This also happened via the boarding schools when generations of Native children were taken away from their families and sent to schools that were quite far away. That when we're talking about funding in rural communities, that has a lot of overlap with what's happening in metropolitan communities, so that even Native people who are living in what we see as traditionally metropolitan areas may have deep connections, travel back regularly to where their homelands are, so that the crossover of people is actually quite great when we're talking about where we fund and sort of how culture migrates with people.
yeah. I think too, but a piece of that is that we define ourselves by place, and so even with the urban artists that we're supporting, their work is often set back home or refers to home, and home is often a rural area. So, what else was I going to say about this point? I think that's it. Oh, remote. There was a conversation too about remote, and remote can happen right within an urban area if we're talking about remote being a form of access. And so there are many conversations to be had around what does access mean. Access could mean remote for some people who might live right next door to a foundation in whatever big city. So. But for our purposes here, we're talking about places that I think might be hard to reach for folks in our community.
Reuben had this great quote when we were talking about this, that in the vastness of the universe, there is no center, which I think is maybe the loveliest way to express cultural humility, which we talk about a lot in our field, that we don't have a sense of really what's central.
So census data. Census data too is an area where there are some, it's problematic. And but what has happened for sure is that gathering census data in rural Native communities has been a challenge and not done very well, often with the excuse that, well, we couldn't find people, so we didn't know how to count them. or in this case, where some of these numbers come from this study, which is part of your bibliography, or if it's not listed at the end, it should be now, is a report called Twice Invisible, Understanding Rural Native America, that was put out by First Nations Development Institute, which tried to reframe the question. So in recent years, in the last couple of decades, there was a notion out there that actually there's a misnomer that most Native people do not live in rural communities, they live in urban centers, and it kind of flipped the script. But what happened with this research in 15 and 16 was that it was then flipped back again to demonstrate that the way that census data was being collected was incorrect. Now, problematic with this research was that they were only counting people of full-blood ancestry. So, you know, it's never easy, but what we go with is what makes sense to us. And so in this case, we saw with the map previously that there's a huge land mass in the United States which could be considered rural, and of all of the Native people that were counted in this survey, nearly 3/4 of them live in rural areas. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just along with what you're talking about, census data, that like Reuben said, the U.S. Census only counts people who only check full-blooded Native descent. So anyone from mixed families like our own, anyone who checks anything else is not counted as Native. So when we talk about even Native populations today, we have a great, far greater numbers than we're talking about. And the other part of this is that when we talk about Native peoples, often we talk about them in terms of disparity. How little we're counted, how little resources go to them. But in fact, something that Reuben and I have noticed in our work in common is that what's defining the communities that we're working in are that they're resilient, that they're innovative, that they're becoming increasingly empowered. You know, we saw the legislature get 2 more Native women this year. More Native artists are being exhibited and represented in international biennials and film festivals. So what we have seen in the communities we work in is this incredible cultural renaissance and of these sovereign communities, which we really want to frame for you. Of when we're talking about rural Native communities, we're talking about centers of incredible cultural power, even when there's not significant economic resources.
Okay, let's see. So the next piece that we want to talk about with you is just really how can the work that you do be more effective in working with Native communities. So we've listed here a few strategies that we're just going to kind of build out for you. Certainly in all of our work, no matter what part of the ecology we're working in, we have to listen to our constituencies, to the communities we serve, and to the artists that we work with. It's basically ground zero for all of our work. We'll get a little bit into how this might differ when you're working inside of Native communities as we move along. But one thing that I was always taught in my Native community is that the Creator gave you 2 ears but only 1 mouth. So I think of it as trying to decolonize your desire to speak constantly. But Lindsie?
We can talk more about listening. One of the protocols here where I am is that it's rude to ask too many questions. The people are deciding how much information to share with you based on the level of trust that has been authentically developed. And I think that takes us sort of into our next area about this, is that every tribe has different different protocols, different cultural practices, different worldviews. You know, there's 566 federally recognized tribes in the United States. There's far more that are unrecognized. Here in California, there are 187 tribes just in this state alone. That's 187 centers of the world, different religions, over 100 languages spoken, over 100 different, you know, sets of mores and how you eat and who talks first. And so I think one of the key points to listening and watching is to see how things are distinct. And you know, we're encouraging here also to do a little research about where you are and the specific culture and nation that you're working in at the moment.
Yeah, I think that those are good, definitely good places to start. I think too, you know, the flip side of that is that you're going to make mistakes. You have to self-forgive and, you know, move forward from those mistakes and take them as places for learning. One way that I've found in going into communities, because even in positions like Lindsie and Lindsie's and mine, you know, the diversity of tribes and practices are so great that even for us there can be a kind of learning curve. And so it's really important to, in order to establish some kind of way into working with a community that you've not worked before, is to have a partner that can provide some expertise and maybe some that has relationships to the tribe, is a tribal member, works with the tribe, that can at least get you to the door. And so that's been incredibly helpful for us at Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. I think another way when we think about what that looks like in terms of philanthropy is working with intermediaries. And so in our work at Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, we often are that intermediary into Native communities and working with Native artists. Lindsie could speak to this too about Native Cultures Fund. And so intermediary doesn't mean that you have to have feet on the ground, but we'll talk about feet on the ground too.
And then the other point here before I move in is that going into all communities, trusting that they know what's best for them, for their current and future vitality, which is hard sometimes for folks in philanthropy coming from strong theories of change and a lot of research to let go of the idea that we have an insight into communities that they might not have into themselves. But I think it's important to remember that we're talking about cultures that have developed in these specific places over, right now, our best estimate is 100,000 years. Native people use the lovely phrase time immemorial to talk about our not knowing how long people have been in the places that they occupy as homelands, and really trusting that cultures that developed over that long amount of time with this focus on, you know, good stewardship, responsibility, accountability, have baked into their cultures and those people the answers for what makes their communities healthy and thrive. And I feel like no matter how you walk in, no matter how many stumbles that we make and laugh to ourselves about, walking in the door with that is really useful.
In terms of seeking long-term relationships, you have to understand that, you know, I'm thinking about that 100,000 years. I'm thinking about something that was told to me in a reservation community, is that we've been here and we will be here after the visitors leave. And so it's a kind of different approach to time. So in building those long-term relationships, it can't just be 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. You have to look long-term and commit to multi-year support strategies. That this is how trust is built. It also means just to show up, to attend events, to get to know people, volunteer for community efforts. Two, of course, you have to know your statistics and about the needs and the assets within a community, but never pretend to be an expert. What else did I want to say about that? So I have some examples of some of the ways that we have been doing our work around that, just to kind of give you a sense of what that might look like on the ground.
I feel like we can't underscore this enough, that parachuting in and out of these communities can often be harmful, and that this is where sometimes intermediaries come in handy, because if you don't have the capacity to make and maintain genuine long-standing relationships in these communities, if you have term limits for program officers so that they won't actually be in touch with these communities for more than a couple of years, then making relationships with organizations that are maintaining these face-to-face, long-term trust relationships is a good way to mitigate what might be a lack of capacity.
Yeah, and I think too, like to think about the different ways of listening. So one is to consider storytelling, to consider metaphor as a way of communicating, or indirect descriptions as ways to kind of transfer this meaning. Don't assume that English is the first language for some folks, or that, more importantly, that English describes something in the best way for a Native person. Different tribes have different ways of carrying themselves, of greeting newcomers, of handshaking, of eye contact, and more than likely you won't find a speak first kind of way of speaking, or even a debate kind of culture that we find in Western culture. So the joke is, never hand an Indian a mic, because but the flip side is to really listen to until a person is done speaking, and then to move to the next person. So that's a lot, huh? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I was just thinking, in terms of practically giving you tools, just allow meetings to be longer in Native communities than you would otherwise. There is often a whole set of communication protocols that might happen that might seem casual or mysterious, or not directly to the point, that have a lot of pedagogy behind them about how you're creating relationships or understanding one another or positioning. And I think just leaving space for that to happen, even if it's not entirely clear at first what protocols are being played out, is a nice practical way to give space.
We've hosted panel reviews where the whole first half hour is just for introductions.
Yeah.
And then another yeah and then another piece is that often gathering is accompanied by food, and so if you don't have it in your budget, then put it in your budget. That's an important part of just being around Native folks, is we like to eat.
And sometimes there's really deep protocols that if you don't feed someone's body, you can't be feeding their mind. That kind of breaking bread isn't casual. It's not just for fun, though it is really fun. It's a deep way of knowing how to be together. In the Ohlone territory that I used to work in down in the Bay Area, it was customary, and still is, that when you have a meeting with Ohlone people, you get together, you eat, you welcome each other, and it's not until everyone is fed that you can even ask, so what are we meeting here for? That you can even look at an agenda. And that is part of a long-standing tradition of hospitality that is a huge part of how Native nations, I think, so often brokered having so much diversity and so much difference and not becoming holy war. And it's incredible that we lived in a place that, had its conflicts, but that there was so much cultural diversity and that it was respected.
One of the, I guess a couple of last points that I would like to make are one, that there's certainly a digital divide in rural Native America. One report that I just read was that there was a very low rate of subscription and for high-speed internet service, 53% in Native rural communities. There are efforts to try to change that, but I think also, besides the areas being remote, it's also, could be part of a kind of value system around the use of technology. The other thing is, when you think about going into tribal communities, is that you might not find an arts organization like you might find in an urban area. It's probably not going to look like that at all. So think about other ways to think about working cross-sectorally within those communities. Tribal museums and cultural centers, health departments. We're doing a project in Siletz, a local tribe, with a women's shelter and combining theater. Language and heritage departments are important allies, education departments. So you just have to kind of switch your mindset a bit about who the partners might be in a community.
Should we talk about our specific?
Yeah. Here we go.
Okay. We wanted to talk about our specific projects, not just to sort of let you know what we do, but to demystify how we put these things into practice. I think sometimes it's hard to wrap our heads around when people say, things look different in Native communities, how you actually address what those differences are. So I work here in California for Indigenous California people at the Native Cultures Fund, which is housed at the Humboldt Area Foundation. The fund was founded almost 20 years ago when a group of philanthropists and Native cultural leaders began to make relationships in this community and jointly recognize the disparity in arts funding that was going to Native communities in California, which was really stark against the tremendous cultural revival and cultural participation that was flourishing in those communities. So out of this relationship was born a fund to support California Indigenous arts and culture. And it's now grown to support culture in the widest possible definition, the entire set of lifeways, teachings, and cosmology that Indigenous people in California practice. It's still supported by a wide range of philanthropy, individual donors, and the Hewlett Foundation, Humboldt Area Foundation, the California Endowment. And it's grown now to cover most of California. And you can see here some of the beautiful people that we have been able to support in these different teachings. So right now our current projects are, we do grant making. And the way we do grant making at the Native Cultures Fund is that all grant making decisions are made by community cultural leaders from across the state. We gather them together. They vary a little bit committee to committee so that we can vary people's expertise and biases. And we trust them entirely to make decisions about how the resources are distributed. This frees up a lot of our staff time from doing certain kinds of due diligence or making the case to a board of trustees or writing lengthy reports. And that time we devote to cultivating community relationships, going on the road, driving up and down rivers all around the state, talking to people, doing outreach, hearing what's important to them, and then designing our programs and capacity building right out of the challenges and opportunities that the communities are asking for. So when communities, get to know us and have seen us there for years and say, hey, can you pitch in on this? we have more of a capacity to respond because we feel like our grant making is being made by experts. The cultural practitioners here know what they need. We use the same participatory grant making process to steward a scholarship, which is specifically for Native students who dedicate their time to strengthening their traditional cultures. And this is in response to the fact that many Native students are penalized in school or in college applications or in other scholarships for choosing to spend time on cultural participation and cultural arts instead of sports or student government or other academic activities. It really goes against the notion that Native kids are given lots of money for college. That, one, is not true, and often their arts participation is not recognized anywhere in our collegiate system. So in addition to grant making, we act as a convener around issues like language revitalization. We, for about a decade, have run a convening the Live Your Language Alliance conference, where we bring in the foremost language revitalists in our area to support one another and to sort of trade strategies on work. We convene around things like land access, issues that the communities we work for say are vital to their cultural and artistic health. Right now we're on a year-long intensive listening campaign around the state to kind of pick up the pulse on what communities and cultural leaders are doing now, because in 20 years things have changed. And that our strategies for doing our work are much like the strategies that we've talked about generally. Build relationships, understanding cosmologies, travel to the places that you work in and see the geography and the world through the views of the people and the language. Funding culture as a pathway to community healing. Arts in Native communities are not just for entertainment or some edification. It's really where the teachings lie. We talked about earlier building long-term relationships or supporting the people who are, if that's not something that you have the capacity to do. And really trusting that communities, even communities that have been disenfranchised from wealth, have within them traditions about wealth sharing, generosity, and balance that allow them to distribute resources in a way that that is equitable for them, that is productive for them, and sometimes in ways that might feel unexpected from someone looking from the outside. The next point is that when we look at the numbers of how Native-led organizations are funded, how minuscule that is, my personal advice is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Right now, you can start small. It doesn't have to be an entire program or portfolio that's dedicated to Native people, but making 1 or 2 grants within existing portfolios, finding 1 or 2 small steps where you can engage in this community, support these communities, would make a tremendous effort. And this is some advice that Adam Fong at the Hewlett Foundation gave me when I asked him how it was that they are a large foundation who does engage in this work. And he said that we take small steps and we trust our partners. Like Reuben said, much of this work will not look in Native communities like it looks in non-Native communities. A lot of it's being done by individuals. A lot of the cultural revival is being done at kitchen tables. Whole languages are being revived in people's backyards. And very little of it, from what we can tell from our recent surveys and travel, has been professionalized. So there's not as many 501c3s out there. There certainly are some, and they are also not being well funded. But find a way or find a partner to fund where the work is happening. And then, just trust that if you're following the local protocols when you're giving, that the process of being there, of being in the community, of engaging, of laughing, of, showing up and making a relationship, that's as healing as the funding. So building those bridges, even if you don't know where they're going to go, really is a beautiful first step.
Okay, so just to talk a little bit about, thank you, Lindsay. So just to talk a little bit about Native Arts and Cultures Foundation, but not to linger there too long. So we support Native peoples across the country. It's been our charge. We've been in existence for 10 years. We started in 2010. We're celebrating an anniversary this year. Yay for us. And here's a bit about all the things that we do. We are a foundation, but our endowment is modest. We also have to seek funding and work with partners in order to serve our communities better. And we offer a host of different kinds of programmatic a host of different kinds of programmatic offerings, and then you know, a part of that certainly is grant making, but we pride ourselves on being on trying to be more of a service organization and thinking of ourselves in that way. I would like to really kind of just jump right into some of the work that we do and let the kind of grantees speak for us, I guess, and to a certain extent. But I think one of the ways that we work inside of Native communities is best represented by our Native Nations Partnerships Program. It's a program where we had to make the case to our funding partner that we needed to take something like 20% of the grant to put aside for travel and for relationship building to go into these communities, not for operations or for anything else like that, but just for the travel piece. Because getting to these remote areas isn't easy. Our staff time is limited, our human resources are limited, and which I'm sure is true with all of you on the phone. And so and because we've been reiterating the fact that in order to develop relationships, you have to be there. It's one way to kind of to navigate that landscape. And so the way that this program works is that we approach Native nations and we seek to partner with an organization or with artists in the community to provide funding that is clearly not available for them in large part from their tribal community. But oftentimes there's, like Lindsie referred to, there's a lot of things happening. And so one of those projects, for example, is a language arts project in the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, which is east of the Portland metropolitan area on the other side of the Cascades. It's vast and extremely remote. And so there are community members, mostly youth, and they will be working with elders to develop their language skills and through cultural arts practices like music and dance, weaving, and so they'll to be able to then communicate the rest of the state to the rest of the state some of the things that they've learned in, through exhibits and partnering with some museums, moving closer to urban areas. We're similar to that project in Oregon is something that we're doing with with Narragansett folks in New England, around Bar Harbor, Maine. We're working with an organization there called the Narragansett Food Sovereignty Initiative, who will be taking youth to mentor with a community of artists, and they'll be learning traditional arts, and it's a way for them to perpetuate artistic practice amongst the tribe's youth. And then they'll be working with a conservationist to think about food sovereignty and what that looks like for them in their communities, traditional foods, how to plant and harvest them, And then that all ties into how to manage naturally resourced materials. And so that's, those two are used in traditional practices from harvesting to preparation. And so all of this kind of rests within a greater cosmology of the tribe. In our Mentor Artists program, at least half of those artists are from rural communities. We too look at cultural equity in our grant making, and that's one way that we do it. And I have a whole host of those different mentor artists that are working in their communities, but we're pushing up on time here. Told we had 2 minutes, and that was like probably 3 minutes ago. So I'm happy to talk to anybody about any of the projects and some of our methodologies, but I think we're turning it over now to the folks on the webinar to ask some questions.
Thank you, Reuben and Lindsie. That was awesome. You both gave so much information, and definitely want to echo what Reuben said. If you have follow-up questions after the webinar, feel free to email me, and I will direct them to Reuben or Lindsie. But right now we've got some time, and I would like to open the floor up for questions. Please be specific about who the question is for. This is a reminder to ask your questions in the Q&A box to the bottom of your screen. All right. So in addition, the first question I will go to both of you. In addition to arts, what kind of cultural practices are important to fund?
Reuben, would you like to start that one off?
Sure. I think it's almost kind of a way to kind of close your eyes and put your finger down and you'll land on something. But there are different partners that we've taken a look at. Again, we're working with language department, health department, education departments at the tribal agencies. And I think there are always ways to integrate the arts into other aspects of life, particularly when you're working with Native communities, and like the project that I just described, working with a food sovereignty group, so they're thinking about foodways, and it's not necessarily directly related to the arts as it's been traditionally looked at in non-Native communities, although that's changing.
I think language revitalization is a big one. A lot of, as Reuben was saying, meaning within Native communities is embedded in language. There are all sorts of concepts in Native languages that are not expressed in English, and that's really pervasive in a lot of the arts that we see. This is the UN declared this the Year of Indigenous Languages, so it's a nice moment to be doing that. Another thing that we see as an intersection with arts funding is land access. A lot of the cultural practices that we talked about have to happen on a specific place. They don't work in diaspora. So if you have a specific dance for a specific ceremony on your homeland, there is usually a specific place that you have to do that. If that place is now in a national park or being held by private land ownership, that piece of culture, that piece of ceremony and tradition can't be kept alive if there's not access. So that's a big place. And then when you think about a lot of the land-based arts, people who are doing hide arts or basket weaving, pottery, where their materials come from is often places that they are now having a hard time accessing. And then the health of that ecosystem directly relates to the health of that artist. So here in California, we had a bit of a crisis where public lands were being sprayed with pesticides that were not being widely publicized to communities, weavers were going into those areas and stripping the bark and doing a lot of the handwork, and we lost a whole generation of weavers to cancer before it was recognized that access to healthy land and the thriving of native arts were so deeply connected by those land managers. And like Reuben said, food sovereignty, health, these are all connected to native arts. These are cultural practices that are really vital to community well-being. And in the communities I work in, a lot of things like sacred sites construction of dance houses and places to do ceremony has a huge impact in the anti-violence movements in communities and community resilience and a decline in suicide rates. So there's kind of like he says, the broad spectrum of how communities are thriving. All of those intersect with the arts. All of those are cultural practice.
Yeah. I would add to that there are artists and culture bearers that are working inside of social and political movements that often have ties to land bases. And so as we think about Standing Rock, which we had a picture up of that earlier, there are movements like that, even though they haven't reached the haven't reached the media in the same way. Those things are happening all across the country. And so any way that you can get inside of those struggles with Native people is can be just as valuable as anything else. But one thing in terms of land acknowledgement that I always come to, which is hopefully the next step, and especially when we're thinking about philanthropic dollars, is how then do we get the land back into Native hands? We know how to take care of it, and so there are a lot of ways to work around repurchasing land and setting it up in trust and that kind of thing. Those might be for your environment departments if you have them, but
yeah, that's definitely helpful. Thank you. We have another question that actually thinks outside of Native communities. The person asks, do you have advice for statewide funders on how to prioritize rural applicants within larger programs that are open to applicants from all demographics?
Lindsie?
Should I take this one, Reuben?
Sure.
Cool. A way to prioritize them is to visit those communities and do kind of grants roadshows. This is something that we do. I mean, I work at the Native Cultures Fund, but we are here at the Humboldt Area Foundation. We're a community foundation in a rural community. We serve a pretty large area, some of which is incredibly rural and some of which is relatively less rural. And what we notice is we get applications from where we go. So if we go to a community and we talk to people and we let them know what is available, we'll see a rush of applicants from there. And it really is the number of good applications from an area that to us we've noticed really affects where our funding dollars go. And you can also set a certain amount aside for rural, but I think especially if site visits are any part of your application process, like Reuben says, making sure that you have the resources to do site visits in rural communities, or even if it's as basic as having them take a video. But if there are communities that you or the committees that you're working with haven't been in and aren't familiar with, having someone in there or someone go there, I think, is really the greatest way to increase access. And if you have community-based grant making, have more grant makers from rural areas and you will have more connections.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you know what? There's actually a question that speaks to more grant makers in the area and partnership that someone asked. So maybe Lindsie, you can pick this one up, and Reuben offer some thoughts as well. What's the first step you take when reaching out to partners, and how do you conduct those initial meetings? I
guess it depends on the Partners, I'll give the example of when I came up here to the Humboldt Area Foundation. My family hasn't lived here long. We moved on to Wiyot land. We had been on Ohlone land for a long time, and the first thing I did was wrote a note to the chairman of the tribe on whose land where I was, asking if there was any way that he had time to sit down and talk, and if he had ideas for how the foundation could be better guests on his homeland. And then I waited. I didn't assume that that talking with me was his highest priority. And he called back, and we just started an open conversation of like, how are things going? How has the foundation been guests? What would you like me to know and or educate myself more about in being here? And so the method of the partnership developed out of that open conversation. So it really was, and also just when there were calls for volunteers to do things like, cater an event or staff an art opening, I would go and volunteer and meet people there and just be accessible outside of office hours and trust that when people were ready, they would come and they would start talking. As opposed to sort of going and saying, hi, I want an agenda, I want a partnership, I want. So that's the way I work when I come into a new area is, get to know people and be available somewhat more passively at first. How about you, Reuben? You do this a lot.
I think it's, it's definitely all about that relationship building, and so we rely on our networks. And networks start within the organization. So if we don't bring personal relationships, then we look to our board, we look to different stakeholders, and then we go from there. Because we're already working in this arena, it's probably a little easier for us. But I would make that same suggestion to any of you that if it's a challenge in your organization, then you have to begin to look at what expertise you have on hand, who you have on your board, who you have on staff, in order to begin to think more effectively about how to get inside of these communities, at least have the kind of cultural competencies that are required. In our case, because Lindsie and I are both working with Native organizations, to look to have Native people on your board, to hire Native people on your staff so that you have that expertise on hand. I would say, too, in terms of strategies for state organizations, to think about having part of your budget set aside specifically for those rural communities instead of bringing them into a fully competitive field with urban organizations. And if that's not the case, then to build the competencies of your review panels and of the staff so that there are different kinds of metrics that are being used for rural communities. Not necessarily what it looks like on the table or on paper, and in the way that people think about criteria, but ways that people are at the table as people in looking at the applications and thinking about rural communities, and really thinking more about value to the community, impact in the community, rather than ability to write a grant.
Reuben brings up something really important. Often you'll need to be introduced to be welcome into a community. You'll need to be invited. So there are definitely situations where it wouldn't be appropriate for me to call a cultural leader up and say, hey, you want to have lunch? I need to, within the people that I already know, rely on being introduced. And so, reaching out to your colleagues in philanthropy to make those introductions or to do that work is really important.
Thank you. Thank you both for all of that awesome information, your responses to the questions, the presentation itself. That was fantastic. And so we've come to the end of our session, but before we go, I want to say thank you to Lindsie and Reuben. As I said, you both offered quite a bit on the webinar, and I know folks will have a lot to go home with, or go back to their offices with, I should say, and continue this work funding rural, remote communities, Native communities, and those that are not Native. So today's presentation has been recorded, and we'll be sending you a link to the file for this presentation in the next few days. And immediately after this webinar, we invite you to take a survey, because that survey gives us valuable feedback so we know how to make our webinars better. And if you have further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, and thank you for joining us. Have a great day.